It's June 1995. A man by the name of Kevin sits quietly in a solitary confinement cell in a Los Angeles metropolitan prison. He's been there for 8 months. His bed is a raised concrete slab, there are no windows, and the space measures a measly 80 squared feet. He's there for a non-violent crime in which there are no direct victims. So, what's going on? It's fear, or more specifically, fear of his mind and exactly what it's capable of. For you see, Kevin's been labelled as a hacker, a computer criminal. In fact, he's said to be so dangerous that he can actually fire live nuclear missiles simply by whistling into a payphone in the prison's rec hall. What? Is such a thing even possible? Well, as it turns out, the basic premise, according to the prosecution at least, is pretty straightforward. First, Kevin would pinpoint the exact undisclosed location of a theoretical modem located in a bunker underneath a mountain in a secret NORAD base. He'd then find that modem's telephone number, and of course the code word required to call it, but that's a given. And then, rather than calling it in the traditional manner, Kevin would whistle, with perfect pitch, mind you, the exact hidden frequencies that the analog phone system of the time used, in order to issue launch codes to the missiles. I mean, it's child's play, right? It's child's play 3 to be exact. So could Kevin really do this? No, it's completely stupid. In fact, he actually let out a big chuckle in the courtroom when the idea was first expressed. So then, why was the idea expressed? Did they make it up, or was there something to this? Well, today I want to answer that question. But I also want to give you guys an insight as to what goes on in the mind of a hacker and how that mindset might just help you in your own lives. So, our story starts way back in 1969, a year of space races, moon landings, Woodstock festivals, and Manson families. It's a pretty average time for everybody. Unless, of course, you're one of these guys. And as you can see by looking at them, they're a bunch of freaks, right? But that's with a PH. That's a combination of phone and freak. It's a subculture that evolved around the analog phone systems of the 1960s. Whoops. 1960s. To the original freaks, they just wanted to answer one simple question. How does the phone system work? Which begs the question, who cares? Why would anyone care how the phone system works? Well, I think the essence of my talk is that there is no why. I think tackling intellectually complicated subjects is justified simply by the fact that they are indeed complicated. We don't have to worry ourselves with any supposed benefits that might come. Sometimes those benefits might be obvious, and other times we'll have no idea. But the point is, the benefits will come. So, we can think of these guys as hackers before the term was ever really used in the mainstream. So what is a hacker, right? We hear this term thrown around all the time. Facebook hacking, email hacking, credit card hacking, and life hacking. I really hate that one. So the original definition of the word hacker was simply someone who's interested in technology and how it works. But not just how it works, how it really works. Okay? To the average Joe, understanding how a DVD player works means plugging it in and playing a DVD. In Ben's case, it's probably Twilight. But to a hacker, understanding a DVD player means having it sprawled out on your lounge room floor. That's why I want this slide. In 147 very well understood pieces. Actually playing a DVD is far less interesting. So, this bloke's name is Joybubbles. Yeah. Joybubbles, that's one word. He legally changed his name from Joe Ingresia to Joybubbles sometime in the late 1980s. He had an IQ of over 170, was completely blind, and had something known as absolute or perfect pitch. And it's the latter that we're really interested in today. Absolute pitch is a rare auditory phenomena in which a person can identify and emulate a musical note without a reference. So you could say something like G minor, and Joybubbles could whistle you a perfect G minor note, or 2000 hertz, etc., etc. Now, keep in mind, you actually have to read and write, learn to read and write music, but perfect pitch makes it a whole lot easier for you. So, when Joybubbles was a little kid, 7-year-old kid specifically, he began playing around with his family's telephone. And it was one of those old phones where you put your finger in and had to, dial it manually. Mario might remember those. Where is he? And so, sometimes he would dial recorded messages and listen to them just for the fun of it. And other times while he did that, he would whistle. It was the 50s, everybody was whistling. And so one time, while listening to a recorded message and whistling, the phone cut out abruptly. Intrigued by this, as any hacker would be, even a 7-year-old one, Joybubbles began to try and find a pattern. And what he found was that when he whistled the fourth E above middle C into his phone, it would cut out every time. That's weird, he must have thought to himself. And so he became obsessed with his family's telephone. He'd spend hours in his bedroom, dialing, whistling, waiting. And after what must have been countless days and months of doing this, Joybubbles realized that if he whistled different tones into his phone at different times, he could cause it to do all sorts of interesting things. Now, as it turns out, Joybubbles had discovered something very fundamental about the phone system of the time. The whole thing was controlled by sounds. So if you knew the frequencies and the timings, then you could control the system. Now, as a side note, the fourth E above middle C is also known, as I mentioned, I think I mentioned it, as 2600 Hertz. And as a result, 2600 has become something of a cult icon in the hacking scene. We see it on magazines, on movies, on books, in user groups, and hey, even on clothing. This is an original. Had that valued at least $3. So, anyway. Anyway. Over time, Joybubbles realized that if he called a toll-free number and whistled 2600 Hertz into the receiver before the call was answered, then the long-distance exchange would free up the line, but the local exchange wouldn't know about it. So Joybubbles was then able to reroute that call however he saw fit, whether it was long-distance, local, or international. It didn't matter. The phone company had already tagged the call as toll-free, and so it bypassed all billing. So who wants to hear what it sounded like? Somebody wants to hear what it sounded like? He does. The DJ wants to hear. Good, it's part of the script.
If you had perfect pitch like blind phone freak Joe and Grecia, you could whistle calls through the network.
Let's see if I make it this time. This is really hard to do. It sounded like all the tones were present, so the phone should be ringing a bell now. Okay, it hit the phone. It just takes a little while.
He even showed off his skills for the local media.
From his one phone to a town in Illinois and back to...
So that's how he did it, and that was him whistling if you didn't realize. That was the culmination of years of hard work. This now 20-something-year-old kid had taught himself a completely alien language, entirely unaided. And it's not like any language like Spanish or French, right? You couldn't just go down to the library and pick up a how to speak to your phone for dummies book. It must have been really exciting for him. And hey, others thought so too. Around campus on UCLA, he became known as the Whistler, and he'd have groups of up to 40 people surrounding him while he made prank calls to the Vatican, and even to the Pope at 4 a.m. at once, and he wouldn't get up, unfortunately. And then in 1992, a blockbuster film by the name of Sneakers came out. And in that film, as you can see here with the messed up eyes, there was a blind phone freak by the name of Whistler, who was based directly on Joybubbles. And there's even a book about Joybubbles called Decoding the Phone. I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic read, well, supposedly. And then so Joybubbles may have been the first, but he certainly wasn't the last guy that was passionate about the phone system and how it worked. The phreaking scene was full of guys just like him who wanted to go bigger and better. In effect, Joybubbles had really just opened the floodgates. And pretty soon, a friend of Joybubbles by the name of John Draper, who you'll notice fits perfectly in with my pedophilia theme for this morning, famously discovered that, let's get him off the screen, that a kid's whistle found in the Captain Crunch breakfast cereal, if blown correctly, could also produce a perfect 2600 hertz tone, which is pretty good considering he didn't have perfect pitch. And so there he was whistling into his phone with a kid's toy and reaping the benefits. Or John Draper, who was forever the prankster, somehow supposedly also found out the code word that allowed one to be connected to the White House, which was, I think, Olympus at the time. And so naturally he called, said the code word, and got through to, in Draper's own words, someone that sounded a lot like Richard Nixon. And so Draper calmly told the president that there was quite a serious toilet paper shortage in Los Angeles. But as you can imagine, he wasn't too impressed with that, and the phone call didn't last much longer. And I'm sure they changed their password as well. So the race to take what people like John Draper and Joybubbles had done and go bigger and better was on. But I think at this point, it's worth noting that hackers and programmers in general are fundamentally lazy people, which you may have known already. But by that, what I mean is that we don't want to have to resolve dead problems. We want to look forward to the next big thing. In fact, one of the best descriptions of hacking I've ever heard is that it's like continually hitting an intellectual wall, scaling it, only to find yourself facing an even bigger intellectual wall. And it's that continual process that drives us. So because we're always looking forward to the next big problem, we need to find ways of automating the old tasks. And in the phreaking scene, this was done with a little electronic device called a blue box, which you'll notice is neither blue nor is it particularly a box. So blue boxes were designed and generated by phreaks in an attempt to automate the task of generating the correct tones at the correct times. So then it was simply a matter of pressing a button, dialing a number, and pressing send on the blue box, and voila, free untraceable phone calls, which made them a real hit with the mafia. So the best blue boxes in town were created by two budding young entrepreneurs from California. These guys actually met with Joybubbles on many occasions to work out how they'd make their own blue boxes. I think it's amazing that these two young hackers were able to, from 20 bucks of scrap metal and cheap electronics, produce devices that could control a multi-billion-dollar telecommunications industry. And as some of you might have noticed, these two guys were none other than Steve Jobs and his mate Steve the Hair Wozniak. These guys built and sold these machines and sold them around the UCLA area. Oops. And although by this time the phone companies had caught on to it and everything was completely illegal, they were able to make about $6,000 profit from their little venture. In fact, they didn't even stop until they thought perhaps their work on the Apple I might make them a little bit more money. And we all know how that worked out. So over the next 20 years, other boxes were invented, like the black box that allowed phreaks to receive calls that were free to the caller as like a reverse blue box. The red box, seen in the middle there, that simulated the tones that payphones made when coins were inserted into them, so that's free phone calls on payphones now. The bud box that allowed you to tap into your neighbour's phone, which is always handy. And even the assassin box that simply gave you a gigantic electric shock as soon as it touched your ear. So, sure, actually using any of them might land you a couple years in prison. But hey, they all required a deep understanding of the phone system in order to be developed. And I think there's something in that. Something about the passion these guys had in understanding the phone system really helps me in my own work, even if it is far less likely to end in electrocution or prison time. So now that we have such a deep understanding of the phone system, why stop at free calls, right? Surely there's other ways that you can bend the system in ways it's not necessarily intended to bend. And that brings us to one of my favorite hackers of all time, this guy, Kevin Poulsen. So here's a horribly pixelated photo of Kevin Poulsen breaking into a telephone exchange to see how it worked. Here's an equally pixelated photo of Kevin Poulsen inside that telephone exchange. And then here's a photo of Kevin Poulsen a few years later when he was arrested for those crimes. Okay, sure, he might have had a few issues with authority, But that didn't stop him from pulling off some of the coolest hacks of all time. And although these days he lives a fairly quaint life as an editor at Wired magazine, his early days revolved around the phone system and a pre-internet network known as the ARPANET. So Kevin seemed to have an insatiable urge to understand how the government was using the phone system. And like the other guys I mentioned, he really just wanted to know. He didn't want to hurt anybody. And he determined that the best way to know things was to simply use them. And so he began dumpster diving out the back of telephone exchange buildings, looking for decommissioned equipment, documentation, anything he could get his hands on. In fact, he got so much of this stuff that he actually had to take out rent on a storage container to put it all. Kevin also used a technique known as social engineering in his hacking, which is effectively tricking people into giving you information they're not supposed to. There's an old saying in the hacking community that the best way to get someone's password is to simply ask them for it. So, on at least 3 occasions, Kevin confidently walked into a telephone exchange building, dressed in the appropriate garb, flashed a fake ID, explained that he was a private contractor and needed to see some equipment, and went on his way. No questions asked. But in 1988, when Kevin was about 21 years old, he fell behind on rent for that storage container I mentioned before. And so they had a look inside. And in there, they found piles and piles of stolen telephone equipment and documentation and some actual stolen stuff as well. So naturally, this is the 80s, you weren't supposed to have this equipment, so they called in the FBI. And they did some more research on Kevin, and they had found out that he had uncovered some documentation via the ARPANET that detailed some assassinations that had taken place. And so naturally, the FBI, in all of their wisdom, assumed that Kevin was in cahoots with the Russians. Some sort of KGB spy, like a terrorist, right? And so naturally, a warrant was put out for his arrest. But Kevin went underground and evaded the law for at least 18 months. So why would Kevin take such risks, right? Why would he mess around with the FBI? Did he know it was illegal? Sure, he knew it was illegal. But like I said, there is no why. He needed to know. And the intellectual challenge was more than enough motivation of him, regardless of the consequences. So how does a fugitive hacker support himself financially? Well, the way Kevin solved this problem, in my opinion, is pure genius. Basically, he tricked radio stations into giving him free Porsches and lump sums of cash whenever he felt like it. Which begs the question, how? Well, in 1990, a popular LA radio station by the name of Kiss FM would run a weekly call-in contest in which listeners I should say, would wait for a series of songs to play and then call in. And the 102nd caller each week would win a free Porsche. Simple as that. So on June 1st, something like that, who cares? Those 3 songs were played in the magical order. All 8 phone lines lit up instantly. The calls were coming in thick and fast. Lucky number 102 was this bloke, Michael Peters. So he came in, he showed his ID, had an interview, got in his Porsche and drove away, $50,000 richer. But as you may have guessed, Michael Peters was actually Kevin Poulsen, who was previously Mr. Black, Dr. Thompson, and even Mrs. Esterhouse. So it took me a while to understand how this hack actually worked. Everyone said he did it, but no one explained how. But eventually I found out, and I got to tell you, it's pretty complicated. But I think I can give you a fairly high-level overview without getting bogged down in the technicalities too much. I'll try, at least. So basically, Kevin used his understanding of telephone switching to change the radio station's phone number to a new number that only he knew. He then set up a phone in his office and forwarded the old number to it. And on that phone, he set up a call forwarding service to the new number. Okay? So now Kevin is a middleman between the general public and the radio station. So calls would still come through, but only while Kevin wanted them to. And so he'd wait until the competition started, and he'd sit back in his office and he'd watch the calls come through. Every time a call was forwarded, a little light would flash. And he'd count 1, 10, 50, get up to about 99, and he'd simply take the phone off the hook. And then everyone in the general public would just get an engaged tone, which isn't that surprising, right, considering you're calling a radio station during a competition period. So then, using another phone, Kevin would start making the calls himself to the new phone number. He'd pick up the phone, and they'd say, "I'm sorry, sir, but you're caller number 99. And he'd say, "Oh, damn." And then he'd pick up the phone again, and they'd say, "I'm sorry, sir, but you're caller number 100. And he'd say, "Oh, no." You know, putting on a different voice every time so they didn't realize it was the same guy calling. And to make matters worse, he needed to simulate the traffic that the radio station would be getting if there was all 8 phone lines, right? And so he had a whole array of other phones set up with a speed dialing service on them. So as soon as you picked up the receiver, it dialed the new radio station phone number. So there he was saying, "Oh, damn," all the time picking up these phones and putting them down again. And then eventually, he'd pick up the phone, and they said, "Oh my God, you're calling number 102. And he'd freak out, or he'd pretend to be excited at least. He'd come in, he'd get a friend to come in perhaps, show a fake ID, get in the Porsche, and drive away $50,000 richer. And the great thing is that Kevin didn't do this just once. He did it whenever he felt like it. In total, he had 3 Porsches, $50,000 in cash, and 3 vacations, family vacations to Hawaii. You know, for a guy without a family. It's not bad, really. Well, unfortunately, Kevin's downfall came when a segment was shown on a popular TV show called Unsolved Mysteries with Robert Stack. I don't know if I love this television show, I really do. But in this segment, they made Kevin out to be some sort of KGB spy, you know, armed and dangerous. In fact, they called him a computer genius gone astray, which is actually pretty accurate. But at the end of that television show, they showed a photo of Kevin along with a phone number in which users should call if they have any information. But mysteriously, that phone number went dead the moment Kevin's face was shown on the screen. And I asked him about it, and he said it had nothing to do with it, but I have my suspicions. So, from the inquisitiveness of Joybubbles as a 7-year-old kid all the way through to the FBI knocking down Kevin Poulsen's front door, we can see that for hackers, the quest for knowledge overrides all else. And sure, you know, they got the cash, the cars, the free calls, a chat with Nixon, a gander with the Pope, and then free meals and board in a correctional facility for 20+ years. But that's not what they were really after. The real goal was simply to understand the phone system and everything there was to know about it, regardless of the consequences. And so you're sitting here thinking, you know, I don't really give a shit how my Nokia, or I should say iPhone for this car, how my iPhone works. And that's cool. I don't expect you to care how your phone works, but the same philosophy can apply to almost anything. So pick something you're actually interested in and throw yourself at it. You'll never know what magical things you'll discover. Thank you.